In 2023, China wanted to dock a maritime research vessel Shiyan 6 in Colombo for research purposes. India objected to the docking and Sri Lanka asked China to defer the visit. However, China insisted on sticking to the original schedule. The United States also expressed concerns about the docking of the Chinese vessel. The current controversy is not unique. Last year, there was a similar situation with another Chinese vessel, the Yuan Wang 5. Many other ships, such as the Japanese destroyer Akebono, South Korean Navy destroyer Kwangeto the Great, the Indian naval ship Airavit, Indonesian naval ship KRI Bimasuci 945, and United States naval ship Brunswick arrived in the country.
Domestic policy can only defeat us. Foreign policy can kill us. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is Sri Lanka versus world major powers. How do we battle it out? Is Sri Lanka's foreign policy on limbo? Joining us this evening on the show are Dr. George Cook, diplomatic historian. Also joining us this evening on the show is Professor Samitha Hettige, expert on strategic studies and conflict prevention, Kusum Vijaythilaka, foreign policy analyst, as well as Dr. Harinder Vidanage, Director, International Relations of the Kotalawala Defence University. Let's start off tonight's show with Dr. George Cook, diplomatic historian, on your thoughts on Sri Lanka's foreign policy and where do we stand right now? Your time starts now.
Thank you for the invitation, Shamir. When we look at foreign policy and where we are right now, we've got to look at situations that are unfolding not only in our neighborhood but also in the world and how we are responding to them and what action we are taking. This last few weeks have been very crucial. We've seen Indian Ocean gaining significance. We've had the IORA sessions taking place. We've had a lot of focus on the country. Has it been helpful to us? We're now talking about vessels. We're talking about visits that are taking place. Significant visit is underway at the moment. These are all important factors that we have to consider. But we must also realize that irrespective of who's coming here or where we are going or what we are doing internationally, we must have and something that I've repeated on this platform so many times before this as well, we must have a strategy of what we want to achieve at the end of the day. We must know where we want to go and what we want to get out of every relationship that we have developed, bilateral or multilateral. And sometimes we wonder whether we do have a strategy. We do have a way and a means through which we are trying to achieve some kind of larger objective. Sometimes that might not be the case. And that is where it is worrying, that is where it is concerning. As you very rightly said in your opening remarks, foreign policy can kill us if we go and do something wrong, and that is why we have to be extra cautious, extra concerned. Extra resources have to be devoted into foreign affairs. We want to have more investment, we want to have more tourists, we want to have more trade, we want to have better image built in the world. All of these depend on the external world. How much are we putting into that particular sector? Depends on what you put in, what you want to get out of it. So this is where we've got to focus a lot more on foreign policy than we are doing right now. We've got to ensure that we've got our priorities straight. We've got to have a strategy of what we want to achieve. But most importantly, we must know what we want to achieve. Foreign policy must aid us to prosper our domestic policy, must help us to develop particular sectors that we want. We've seen that in the past, it has been done, it has been used. We've got to make sure that foreign policy is going to be to our advantage. We should be proactive here, not necessarily reactive on a continuous basis.
Dr. George, if you look at what has transpired over the last few weeks with regard to President Ranil Wickremesinghe's statement in foreign media saying that Sri Lanka's interest is at heart as far as the country is concerned, how do you view this statement?
Good statement to make, but we've also got to see action. We've also got to see action at every level. It has to trickle down throughout the foreign policy structure in the country. It has got to be a situation in which everyone is singing off the same sheet. You can't have one or two having ideas or one or two wanting to do something and the rest falling behind or not being aware of the larger policy formulation. Because when it comes to implementation, we sometimes wonder, we sometimes look around, we see things developing, we see issues going on. Where are we? Why aren't we at the table? If we are at the table, are we making effective contribution at the table? These are questions that we have to keep asking ourselves, and sometimes we are probably not making that effective contribution.
So, Dr. George, this evening when Niresh and I were discussing about this topic, one of the factors that came into mind was how Sri Lanka was very quick to condemn Canada's statement recently on the matter concerning the killing of Nijar. And we saw the manner in which how the foreign minister was very quick to respond to that. However, when it came to the Chinese geophysical scientific research vessel Xinyan 6, it seems that Sri Lanka took the side of China. At one point it takes the side of India, and on another occasion they take the side of China. What sort of foreign policy is this?
It's not a case of taking sides. You've got to take Sri Lanka's side here. When it comes to the Canadian-Indian issue, at the end of the day they will resolve it. We'll be left looking very stupid at that point by going to intervene in someone else's issue. As a result of doing that, did India get extremely happy with us and pat us on the back and say thank you very much for standing up for us? That wasn't the case. We have our own issues with Canada which we have to resolve. We don't need to aggravate that Canada-Sri Lanka relationship anymore by taking on someone else's issue. So sometimes we have to really be careful of what we say internationally, because these things are being taken note of and those countries are acting accordingly. We've had a checkered past with Canada, and it's not something that we want to aggravate any further. Canada has a large Sri Lankan or ex-Sri Lankan population over there. We need to be looking at ways and means of engaging with them.
But the question is, why do we take India's side on one occasion and the side of China on another? Because India condemned the docking of Xinyan 6 in the country as well. They say that the intentions of this vessel is not to experiment the bed of Sri Lanka, but to ensure that in the event in the future, if they want to dock any naval vessels in the country, that they can do the research accordingly. So it seems that India was very angered by this move, by allowing the Xinyan 6 to dock in the Sri Lankan waters.
Hopefully there has been a lot of diplomacy that has taken place behind closed doors between the two capitals, and we've been able to explain things to India. Because at the end of the day, Shamir, I don't think Sri Lanka is in a position, if some country wants to go past this way or come into our waters, for us to stand up and say we don't want you coming, especially if we are under obligation to any country. So this is where it's very good for us to be in a very strategic location, but it also has its consequences, both positive and negative, and we've got to be very mindful of that. So at the end of the day, whether we work closely with one country or another, hopefully what we are also seeing is a lot more diplomacy that is taking place behind closed doors in order to explain our position, our situation. It might not be out there in the media, but hopefully it is being done behind closed doors.
Thank you very much, Dr. George Cook, a diplomatic historian. I now move my attention towards Professor Samita Hettige, expert on strategic studies and conflict prevention.
Thank you for having me. Well, foreign policy, to my view, is the muscle of the issue. If I may quickly go to the bone, Sri Lanka is passing a time where there's a generation change, and a generation which did not see the 30-year conflict in a very serious way, and the JVP uprising of the late 1980s is coming into the society, and they see the world in a different way, and that will have an impact on our foreign policy in the medium and long term. At the same time, moving on with what Dr. Cook ended, like we should learn. We can always learn, because historically we have worked with all these powers, and neighborhood diplomacy is something that we need to focus very seriously. And if I may quote China Institute of International Studies, on the 24th of October they had an international symposium on neighborhood diplomacy, and their key focus was amity, sincerity, mutual benefit and inclusiveness. So those are areas that I think Sri Lanka also can focus. And we have to be free trade ports, or we have to be free, and we have to be that key player in the middle of the Indian Ocean, so where we can work hard with both our our immediate neighbor India and our historic friend China to get the country out of the crisis. And at this moment, what I feel is that economic restructuring and public administration should be given the foremost place. I repeat the word foremost, to get the country back on track using foreign policy. So, since you mentioned Xi'an 6 and Yuan Wang 5 last year, I think historically Chinese ships have come here. That's why even before colonization, Trincomalee was known in Sinhala as Chinamaraya, and the British started calling it China Bay. And our chronicles indicate that the former port Godawaya was a focal trade center for the Persians. So I think historically the Indian Ocean, or the Lakshadweep Sea, was divided, the eastern parts for the eastern powers and the western parts for the Persians. So we have a good base to move forward, and our foreign policy can always move forward with, as Dr. Cook quite rightly mentioned, country first. We need to work with everybody, very especially China and India, because we should not forget that China and India are very strong, very close trade partners, and historically and culturally they are very close. And if I may quote one example, South Indian Brahmin or master Bodhidharma is considered to be the person who gave martial arts and so many things to the Shaolin monks at the Shaolin monastery. That's what the legend says, and Chinese and the Indians, they don't have any argument on that. So we should remember that Chinese and the Indians have worked very closely over the centuries along the ancient Silk Road and even after that. So we, being a very small country at a strategic location, we have a big responsibility to use both the powers for our benefit.
Professor Samita, before I move on to Kusum to pick his thoughts on this subject, you said that Sri Lanka is placed strategically in the Indian Ocean, and my question to you is, are we boxing beyond our weight category right now when it comes to gaining advantage in the Indian Ocean?
Well, Shamil, there are, to my understanding, there are about 28 countries in the Indian Ocean rim, and the talented, or those who can perform, are performing at their best to get the benefits from the cascading Indian economy and the cascading Chinese economy, very especially the Belt and Road Initiative. So I encourage the Sri Lankans, I mean, policymakers and the people to get involved, because rather than giving the responsibility always to the government and the public administrators,
right,
responsibility rests on the individuals as well.
So very quickly, Professor Samita, you spoke about the Belt and Road Initiative, and you said in your opening remarks that China and India predominantly have been friends for many years, and they've been trading partners for centuries as well. But don't you think the dynamics have changed now? Because if you even look at the Belt and Road Initiative, it's very clear that India has been completely omitted as far as the road is concerned. They're taking an extended route through the Hambantota port and then connecting through the Silk Road Initiative as well. So don't you think the dynamics have now changed?
Not really. I mean, if you look at the voyages of Admiral Cheng He, he has come passing Galle to Beruala and then to Calcutta or Calicut. So that's the historic part.
But don't you think India has been completely ignored this time as far as the Belt and Road Initiative is concerned? Don't you see that as a difference, and don't you see the non-attendance of India in the major summit that was held in China to announce the Belt and Road Initiative, that the biggest absentee was India.
Well, on the 24th of October, I was in Beijing attending this symposium, and there was a big Indian presence. I agree with you on the event that you are talking. Maybe there were less presence, but my understanding is that whenever China, especially President Xi Jinping, whenever he visits South Asia, he will ensure that he touch base with the Indian leaders before he departs to go home. Like when he came in 2014, after the events in Sri Lanka, he went to India, and when he came to Nepal, before going to Nepal, he touched base in Chennai to have a chat with Prime Minister Modi.
So you're trying to say that the India-Chinese conflict that we see right now is a conflict in the kitchen for them, but most of the countries are taking it to the living room at the moment.
Indeed. In fact, to my understanding, there's no conflict between China and India.
Right. So let them sort it out.
Indeed.
Thanks, Professor Samit Hettige, expert on strategic studies and conflict prevention. I now move my attention towards Kusum Vijaytilaka, foreign policy analyst.
Thank you very much, Shamir, for having me, and thank you to everyone. I think my colleagues have raised some interesting questions and points, and I think it's good that we can talk a little bit about the President Vikram Singhe's recent forays abroad. As you know, I think the media covered it extensively, his remarks on the DW channel with Martin Gack and the stance he took, some of the answers he gave. But I also I've written about this recently, where he had another 45-minute or so interview on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly. There was also a Western audience in New York. And he was asked some pertinent questions. I mean, they weren't, they were not difficult questions, I don't think, but they were pertinent. And, I always see Mr. Vikram Singh, President Vikram Singh is very good with history, right? So he was very interested in, I think, you have to understand the President Vikram Singh, when he goes abroad these days, he's an elder statesman now, right? He's someone who's been around the block. He's been a prime minister from the 90s onwards. So I think there's a little bit of this, what can I call it, sort of an old man syndrome, where you go abroad and you sort of have a little more space to breathe than some of the other younger heads of state from relatively smaller nations. So I think he was sort of flexing that. So he was telling the audience, I've been dealing foreign policy, since the 90s, and I was here. I remember when the World War II, he was talking about those times, and he made the Churchill quote and all of that. Within all this, he was asked he was asked the question, is Sri Lanka pro-India or pro-China? And he said, no, I'm not pro-India. We are not pro-India, pro-China. We are pro-Sri Lanka. So this is it's the kind of banality of an answer that you can possibly give. I mean, is there anything for the Sri Lankan president to say other than saying he's pro-Sri Lankan, right? But I think the point was that why is a Sri Lankan president being asked these questions, right? When Sri Lanka is non-aligned. Okay, so from that point of view, I think the questioner is quite clear in why he's asking the question, because there's been a tilt, which everyone around this table understands, that even if you accept the premise of us being non-aligned from whatever 80s, 90s period onwards, there's been a steady shift. Okay, there's been a footprint, Chinese footprint, that's growing larger and larger within the island, and this necessarily creates tension, because we are not just in any random geographic location. We are at the doorstep of India, which is a regional power. And I'll disagree slightly with my colleague when he says that there is no contest between India and China. I think there is definite contest. And it's within that context and contest that Sri Lanka has to look at things like the port city, the Hambantota port, the ships that are docking in our ports, how much control we have over certain national assets.
Right.
So these are things that I think should be considered, and it was an opportunity for, and the other thing my colleagues mentioned is that we are in a specific moment in history right now. Currently, since 2022, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and right now the conflict in Israel and Palestine, these are real tests of the world order and where we are at the moment. And I found it interesting that the Sri Lankan president sort of echoed the BRICS narrative. We are a member of the Global South, and the BRICS is, encapsulates parts of the Global South, and it's a very important sort of coalition that's growing up, and it has been growing for some time. But I wonder if in a moment where a powerful nation invaded another nation, whether this is not the time for smaller nations like ourselves to sort of emphasize the importance of sovereignty, because it's not that we should be worried about someone invading us, it's about a principle. And if you're seen to being, because there's many nations that have to, I suppose, you can't be too critical of Russia.
Right.
India is one, for instance. Right? India, as powerful as they are, as important as they are, as integral as they are a traditional ally of Russia, and they understand their position in that relationship. And that's why they've been very careful about how they approach this matter.
Right.
But Sri Lanka, can we just simply echo a narrative of the global south without considering the issue of sovereignty? I was surprised that the president took that route, and I'll discuss that further.
Kusum, very quickly, you spoke about the non-aligned stance that Sri Lanka has taken in the 1970s. If you look at it, between the 16th to the 19th of August 1976, the 5th summit of the non-aligned movement was held in Sri Lanka under the patronage of Sirma Bandaranaike at that time. And at that time, it was the biggest international conference ever held in Sri Lanka, and one of the greatest achievements in its foreign policy. This was in the 1976 period. However, now, do you think that we are non-aligned, or are we aligned towards certain countries for our interests?
I think we can posture, right? So we can posture a certain way, we can have rhetoric a certain way, but what's important is what is actually happening. What is actually happening on the ground in Sri Lanka. And I think the evidence is overwhelming, right? And let's forget about the large-scale infrastructure projects. There has been multiple reports of Chinese influence in Sri Lanka, quite apart from investments and development, right? And I will also accept most of the countries that have brought up this issue of Chinese interference in their domestic affairs, they're members of the Anglosphere. The most famous case is Canada, which had a commission set up a few years ago, and they found lots of evidence of surveillance, election interference, donations, shirking campaign finance laws. So several other, New Zealand has had a commission, Canada's had a commission, the US, the UK. In such a context, again, I'll go back to the Sri Lankan president being in the Western Hemisphere. Sri Lanka is in debt. Our economy has collapsed. Who is one of our largest creditors? It would be China, right? Some of the projects that China has funded as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, I would say they're failures, some of them, right? They haven't worked out. The revenues have not met the projections. In such a situation, you have to ask questions. And I think it's intriguing that I suppose this is not a place where the president could have done anything. I think this is not the forum to talk about it. But I think within Sri Lanka, within the foreign policy sort of intellectual stream, we should really be looking at this a little more seriously, in the sense of understanding whether our politics is really safe from foreign influence. And I think that's something that's pertinent, given where we are as a country.
Right. Thank you very much, Kusum, for your thoughts. I now move my attention towards Dr. Harinder Vidanage, Director, International Relations, KDU.
Right. Thanks for having me, Shamir. I think if we are focusing on foreign policy as a conversation, I think one of the things we should not get trapped in is these kind of binaries that we have been trapped in for a long time. One of the major challenges the world is facing, no matter whether you are in the US, Europe, or in the eastern corners, there is a common consensus, a tacit consensus that there is a need to rethink existing foreign and security policies. So countries are, and it is invariably been communicated through white papers, through declarations. So the US, there is very clear indication, though the Americans have been putting out so many policy papers, and it indicates there is also what you call still a search for strategy. Of course, do have grand strategies at play, but there is a clear indication that the countries are struggling. And then you saw recently how China brought out their thinking, and how the Chinese foreign ministers and even the president's statements clearly say that we have entered a time which is quite filled with uncertainty, which is some people call it a time that is quite unparalleled to what we had seen in the last 100 years, and even the Russians came out with a new concept of foreign policy early this year. So and if you read through all these foreign policy statements and declarations, you see a clear picture that there is a concern that you are asked to recalibrate and rethink your foreign policy. The same time, and there are fundamental transformations in the world that you have to account for, and there are certain challenges that have come up in the last 5 to 10 years that you have to address. So countries are, I think, big or small, are kind of confronted with these questions. So if you are asking a question about Sri Lanka's foreign policy making, let's not make it like go into this traditional framing of what we have done, whether we had or not, but because I think the challenges that we encounter now and we will encounter in the next 2 decades will be quite different from some of the challenges we try to draw analogies to, because we are, I mean, I agree with Professor Samita on the history, but the fact is that most of these histories that we narrate, and the fact that we are in a modern state system which kind of has gone beyond that, and new identities have been created, and the fact that some of those solidarities we may have had may not be framed at the moment. So we have to deal with existing realities when we talk about foreign policy. So Sri Lanka is facing that particular moment as well, and we are facing it at a very difficult conjuncture because of our domestic situation as well as the rapid transformations that is happening in our neighborhood, which is the Indian Ocean. So our foreign policy, that means, has to be made or remade or rethought within the larger context of what our national security, international security policy is going to be about, what our economic policy is going to be about, and then how the overarching strategy. Because one of the missing components in the conversations in foreign policy has been the idea of strategy, because Sri Lanka has been brimmed with visions. Yeah, the moment we look at a vision undercuts strategies, because visions are not built on strategy, visions are built on aspirations, and we are driven by that, and most people are driven by that. So we had so many visions politically, visions institutionally, visions even within armed services. So I think we have to really bring in the idea of strategy, because strategy is get what we want with what we have, anticipating that everything is against us. So that's kind of this kind of conversation we are having, the equation we are having. So within that context only we have to discuss and deliberate about where Sri Lanka is going to go ahead, based on the domestic situation, the domestic aspirations, whatever the interests that we have evolved at the moment, what are the challenges we are facing within the larger region, as well as the global transformations which is affecting it. So no policy leader can ignore all three. There is a domestic compulsion, there is a regional compulsion, and there is a global compulsion. So the foreign policy that we have to adopt and evolve has to address that. Of course, we have certain traditional foundational principles like the idea of non-alignment. The idea of non-alignment was a 20th century idea about when the world was pretty much ideologically split between the capitalist and the socialist bloc, right? So there is a debate in the world whether we can simplify things as the same now, because Sri Lankans and our education systems are understanding we are very good at a couple of things. We are very good at asking the simple question as a serious question. Who are we with? How can we balance? Who are we going to? That's not the, because we are simplifying a very complex situation. The second thing is, because we have been used to simplifications, we are not geared for complex challenges. So that is why you see this void being filled by so many conspiracy theories, so many political arguments about, So I think we have to fundamentally even think about the questions we ask. Because
Dr. Harinder, if you look at what's happening right now, we've taken different U-turns in terms of international inquiries. We saw in 2015 after Maithripala Sirisena was elected as the president of the country, Sri Lanka took a complete U-turn on the UNHCR resolution, and we co-sponsored that resolution. Come 2019, after Gotabaya Rajapaksa came into play, we saw then Foreign Minister was Dinesh Gunawardena. He took a complete U-turn again, saying that we will oppose this resolution, not co-sponsor it. So internationally, we seem to not have a bipartisan policy when it comes to our foreign policy, and this has become a major concern, giving different signals to the international community. What are your thoughts on this?
This is the very essence of the argument I was making. The fact that we lack a strategy. Though we use the term strategy, strategic thinking, if we had strategic thinking and strategic thinking applied in processes and institutions, such things would have and should have not happened. So the fact that how do a country deal with a situation where it has to face these inquiries, how a country should evolve its own internal mechanisms in dealing with it, and how you built accountability and credibility into those institutions and mechanisms rather than trying quickly to satisfy a certain. So these are questions that have been always used. Then are we then going to take mononationalist policies about providing certain aspects of investment to one country or interest party and then balancing it off to another by giving one infrastructure to. So that is the problem.
Right.
So I think that is what we should illustrate and move out of.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Harinder Vidanagi, Director of International Relations, KDU. You also can join in as far as the conversation is concerned. The number is 076 656 5353. The number once again 076 656 5353. Today, not onto my left, but onto my right is Niresh Eliathambi, Consultant English News Director at Newsfirst. So I'm flanked with you for a couple of weeks now. And Niresh, I have no other option but to look at you when we open the flow of questions from our journalists. So the ball is in your court.
Thank you, Shamir. So let me ask Dr. George, if you were setting the foreign policy of our country, what are the factors that you would look at? And stemming from that, is Sri Lanka right now prioritizing those factors?
I'll answer the second part first. No, we're not prioritizing those factors. One of the first things that we should be doing is we should be reviewing where we are, what we have done, what our positions are, membership in organizations, our bilateral relations. Of course, this is a massive strategy that has to be drawn up here. You've got to do a lot of work that goes into this. You've got to know what it is that is within the national plan that we want to achieve through our foreign policy. We've got to have a national plan of action for that. Foreign policy has got to be a key component in achieving that national plan and national objectives. And this is where foreign policy has got to be used at the end of the day to achieve everything that we want for this country. We want more trading opportunities. We must have a consistent policy that is advocated across all our embassies and high commissions around the world, not only where we have them physically, but also with countries to which we are accredited. We must make sure that we are doing a lot with them out there, plus doing a lot with those missions that are based here in Sri Lanka. We have a large number of missions that are already in our own country. We need to have a concerted policy, and that is where we will look at either from a trade perspective, you want to attract investment, you want to attract more tourism, you want to look at main areas which are going to generate income for this country. This is something that we've been talking about all the time. It's not a case of going and getting loans or grants or asking people to keep helping us. We've got to find ways in which we are going to stand up on our own. And some of those ways are where we enhance trade, where we enhance investment, and where we enhance tourism. But we've also got to realize there are other ancillary factors that we've got to consider. If it's trade, we've got to enhance our basket of goods. We've got to look at how we are going to add value to what we are sending into the world. We've got to add value into how we are interacting with the world. If you look at the sending of the migration of labor from this country, we need to be mindful that when we send people abroad, or when people do go, when we get job opportunities, we're getting opportunities in which we can earn that much more. Skilled labor, what are we looking at? How are we tying it up into the system? Because what we are seeing right now, if we just talk about labor alone, you see unskilled labor going abroad who are sending money back. Skilled labor who's going abroad is not sending money back. They're taking their families and going, and they're settling down elsewhere. There's no money coming back into the country there. So this is where we've got to be very mindful of the fact that we've got to look at where we are right now. We've got to understand our bilateral and multilateral relations. We've got to understand that foreign policy is going to fit into a national plan of action, and we've got to ensure that every step that we take is going to lead to something tangible coming back to this country. That is what we want. We want to improve image of this country. We want to improve opportunities for this country. Foreign policy is the key to do all of that. This is the arm, this is the sector that has to be used to enhance that value. How much of that is happening? In your second part of your question, I don't think that is happening in the way it should be happening.
So, George, you spoke about the DWTV interview that President Ranil Wickremesinghe did recently. Was it you who mentioned about it? Yes, yeah. Yes, okay. But I'm going to refer this question to you, George. If you look at it, President Ranil Wickremesinghe says in this, did you happen to watch this interview, George? Okay, so I'll anyway revisit some of the statements that he made so for the public's benefit. At one point when he was being spoken about the Easter Sunday bombings, he says, Sri Lankan government doesn't have international inquiries, full stop. It's a few people may have asked, but Parliament doesn't. And there is, I forgot to tell you, the FBI reports which says that no one outside was involved. However, President Ranil Wickremesinghe on the 18th of July 2022, last year, when he was the acting president of the country, says, President Ranil Wickremesinghe plans to obtain the assistance of the police authorities of the UK in order to complete the investigations into the Easter Sunday attacks of 2019, as the lack of a proper investigation has meant that this issue is yet to be fully resolved. Now, what would the international community think about our president? Now, last year, when he was the acting president, he says that he's looking for international investigations from the UK on the Easter Sunday bombings. And then, after he becomes president, speaking to foreign media, then he comes and says, Sri Lankan government doesn't have international inquiries.
It's a conundrum, certainly for them and certainly for us. But of course, you've got to understand domestic compulsions are coming into play here. There are lots of other factors that have to be considered. Situation from last year to this year is very different. Power bases are very different, politics changes. So we've got to understand people make statements at particular times, and that's the role of a politician. But we've got to think of the long-term impact. Go back to 2009. Ban Ki-moon undertakes a visit to this country. There is a statement that is issued between the government and the UN Secretary General. In that, Ban Ki-moon says that there are concerns about atrocities that have been committed, and we say the government will look into this. Someone forgot the word alleged. Now we have said we'll look into it. So now guess what? We've got to look into it. We've made that commitment internationally. So we are going to be held up irrespective of what we say. If we have signed on, if we want to get something from some other country, we want European Union's GSP plus. So we play ball according to their terms and conditions, right? You want something from them, you'll have to agree to conventions, you'll have to agree to treaties, because they're setting the rules at that point. So international community will look at these statements. They might wonder what it is that has changed, but they'll also understand dynamics that take place within the country. But there are certain things to which we are being held up internationally, for which we can't shy away from.
So Dr. George, also in the same interview, the president, who to the masses of this country may look like a hero, because the last time that I saw a similar interview was Lakshan Kadirgama's interview to BBC Hard Talk, saying, what have you all done? What has the international community done, and why are you telling us? But even so, President Ranil Wickremesinghe says the UK hasn't got an international investigation, Germany hasn't got an international investigation. What have you got? What are the international inquiries you have gone into? What are the ones that UK has gone into? But little does the president realize that Sri Lankan police service has been named as one of the most corrupt police services in the country. The IGP went on to say that 80% of the OICs are political appointees in Sri Lanka. The Minister of Justice comes on this very show and on record he says the police are corrupt. We have several politicians who come here and who says that the police are corrupt. In a situation like that, don't you think the international investigation into the Easter Sunday bombing is important and imperative as called by the UNHCR?
It certainly is, and this is where we've got to then sort out. Today I'm in power, tomorrow I'm not in power, but we have to have consistency for Sri Lanka. This is what we've got to always be mindful of, what is in the best interest of this country, and that is where we as citizens must keep asking for that, irrespective of what is decided at the highest levels. We as citizens must keep asking for the best processes, the best practices, the best policies to be implemented. And in terms of corruption, we know there is corruption. We talk about it, we read about it, we open the papers every day, we get text messages, we look at social media, there's corruption everywhere, everybody's talking about it. What is being done about it? This is where we as citizens have to be asking that question over and over again and not stop.
Yeah, but now there's an anti-corruption bill, but the implementation of that anti-corruption act is questionable. We see so much of corruption taking place even now. We saw last week, Nilesh, we discussed about the scams that took place at the health ministry, but I'm glad that the Minister of Health has taken some cue from that show and appointed Dr. Anand Abhivikram as the head of the NMRA. So look at the corruption that is taking place at every level. Don't you think the government has a responsibility to play and show the international community that we are on the right track?
Absolutely.
At least now.
We have to take measures in the short term in order to weed out corruption, in order to stop that. But we also need a long-term strategy here, Shamir. At the end of the day, we've got to realize we as individuals have got to say no to corruption. Everybody. Where is this attitude? Now, it's okay to say I am pro-Sri Lankan. Does everybody think that way? Does everybody say that? Is everybody on that stance? Is it in word and deed both? Are we really concerned about this country? Are we in love with this country? Are we trying to do everything possible for this country? This country is such a blessed country at the end of the day. When you look at lots of other countries that we have in the world, each one has their different resources. We are so blessed in that way. But are we concerned? Are we passionate about our country? Are we committed to improving it? No. We're looking at ways to bypass systems. We're looking at ways to do things faster. We're looking at ways to give something and get away with it. These are things that we've got to change. So there has to be an attitudinal change across the country.
Yeah. So
education is one of those areas where we have to start doing that.
So Professor Samita, if you look at the recent incident with regard to the Shiyan 6, this is not the first time that India has raised concern. If you look at it, there was concern by India even in the year 2014. Regarding a Chinese submarine and a warship to dock at its port in Colombo.
Yes.
So this was a major concern even back then. We continue to anger India when India has come to our rescue many a times. Don't you think at least this stand has to change? Why are we relying so much on the Chinese?
Well, not that we rely so much on the Chinese.
Because even if you look at the debt restructuring, China was the last country who came out and said that they will give some leeway for Sri Lanka as far as the debt restructuring is concerned. We were almost pushed to the ledge and we were about to be pushed over the ledge as well. So we were in a situation where we could not decide on our debt restructuring plans because of China. But India came for our rescue even at that time. They gave 2.8 billion Sri Lankan rupees when we were in dire straits.
That's right.
What's this double standard?
Not really, because not only China has lent money to most of the countries in the world, not only Sri Lanka. And of our debt profile, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's a little more than 10% of our total loans that we have taken from China. So the Chinese approach of helping a friend to repay a loan, to my understanding, is different. And as you mentioned, when India gave us this 7 billion, 7 billion, there was another Chinese assistance that came in a different way, which I don't have the details at the moment. But on that debt restructuring issue, China plays a key role, as we all know, within the IMF and all the international agencies as well. So when it comes to restructuring the debts from those organizations, China has played its role, not to the disadvantage of Sri Lanka, but to my understanding, to the advantage of Sri Lanka, because we should understand that we are in a very bad position, and no matter whether it is China's loans or Indian loans or anybody's loans, we have to be very serious on repaying them. And this is the time that we have to use the international economic opportunities that are passing Sri Lanka and happening very close to Sri Lanka to repay the loans. And going back to the ships, Shamil, I think we have to be free trade ports, as I think President Vikram Singh also once mentioned, that we should not have any controls or restrictions to anybody when it comes to entertaining friends. Or I mean, let's say if we also follow this amity, sincerity, mutual benefit and inclusiveness policies, being a very small country in a difficult turmoil economic situation, we have very few other options to come out of it. And
but Professor, you're talking about being a free ports, but that is for merchant ships. Here we have naval ships from different powers.
Yes.
And the Chinese research vessel in question,
that's right,
is actually a naval ship, a naval research ship.
Yes.
So there's a big difference. It's not a container cargo sort of ship which is coming for bunkering. And
not only Chinese warships, Indian warships come here, American warships come here. If you may remember, in the late 1980s, there was the massive US ship.
But these warships are coming as projections of their country's foreign policies, not that they really need to be here.
Yeah, but then it's our responsibility, very clearly our responsibility, to ensure that Sri Lankan territory is not used as a defense base for the disadvantage of another neighbor or not a neighbor.
Now, Professor, the question is, since 2010, Sri Lanka has had approximately around 230 warships arriving at the Colombo port up until 2014. That's the data that's available. But if you look at it, the frequency of Chinese visits to the country has been more. That's the question that Nilesh is asking.
Yes.
You get vessels coming on Sri Lanka for many purposes, for refreshment purposes, for refueling purposes. That's a different story altogether. But this is different because if you look at it, surveying the seabed of a country, that data is very, very important, imperative to the country concerned, not an outside country. Would a Chinese vessel be allowed to go to UK and do a investigation on the seabed of UK?
Or would a Sri Lankan vessel be allowed to go to China and...
Can Sri Lankan vessels go to Maldives and do a research on the seabed? It doesn't happen like that. That is the territorial waters of a country, and we have to protect the
sea of Sri Lanka.
That's right. I mean, the statistics, I don't want to disagree with you, but we must remember that the Chinese are investing their trade surplus all over the world through the Belt and Road Initiative.
No, but that is not. But that's not what the Indians are saying. The Indians are saying China is using the dual-purpose vessel, the Xi'an 6, not only for maritime survey, but also seabed survey for future operations of the Chinese Navy in the Indian Ocean. Now, is this something that we should take it?
I'm not a scientist or a defense specialist,
but do you think that we should take it with a pinch of salt? Is that what you're trying to say?
As a sovereign nation, we should have the right to select our partners. And as you know, that Xi'an 6, according to my understanding, has agreements with NARA and University of Rohun.
Yeah,
So that's
well understood. You can't come and say that you're investigating the seabed of the country for naval purposes. Then Sri Lanka would not allow it, nor would India allow it.
Yes.
You can't make a public announcement of that. So you have to get the NARA involved. You have to get the Navy involved. You have to get these agencies involved to show that this is a survey that is being carried out for maritime purposes.
And as to being a sovereign nation, Professor, I think we lost our sovereignty when the government declared bankruptcy and put itself at the mercy of foreign governments, not just one, but many. So I think the question of sovereignty right now is rather moot.
Yes, you got a point. But then we should prevail. We should prevail whether it's bad or good times with the neighbors.
So we are asking you these questions. Why, Professor Samitha, you are an expert on strategic studies and conflict prevention.
Yes.
So we are saying there may be a conflict between China and India on Sri Lanka. If we don't take action now and address this problem, it would aggravate in the future.
My understanding, Shamil, is that China and India, they are more mature than Sri Lankan
No, but
situation at the moment.
Kusum had a different opinion on that.
Yes, I mean, I don't want to disagree with him, but my view is that Chinese and the Indians, they have a very good understanding, and the Chinese historically and never had the practice of colonizing and starting wars. So, and China-India relations, like if you take the past century, there had been no serious matters. Like, of course, there were issues within the borders.
There have been several wars.
Yeah.
Several wars on the borders.
On the borders, but they have managed to resolve it. And even Sri Lanka got involved once when Mr. Bandaranaike was there.
So how can you say there were no major problems?
There were conflicts, but it was resolved.
And those conflicts have brewed over the last few decades, and we are in this situation now as far as China and India is concerned.
Yes, but my focus is that we have
centuries ago China and India may have been better, but what happened after 1960s is what we're talking about.
Yes, but then
this century,
India and China are both economically fast developing. So I'm quite confident that they will ensure that they will not get into unnecessary conflicts.
So, Kusum, you agree with the analogy of Professor Samitha, or you want to disagree? Or
I disagree.
You can support it as well if you want to.
I think that the India, China, Russia, the entire world's political scenario is realigning, right? There's a realignment that's happening all over the world. Now, I think India and China, it's difficult to say that they're not at conflict. Certainly there are places they will work together. They're very practical and pragmatic administrations traditionally. They work where they need to work. And when there is a conflict, when there's time for conflict, they are ever ready for conflict as well. This is where I bring in Sri Lanka, and I think when you talk about foreign policy, it's important to consider something that's a little bit colloquial, not something a bit away from the expertise, but just take a look at something as simple as Sri Lanka's image and how we are perceived. And I think foreign policy and domestic policy has something to do with how we are perceived in the world. Now, just take a look at, we mentioned the president changing his stance from one year to the next. This is not new, right? I mean, before he became the president, Prime Minister Wickremesinghe was adamant that the Aragale should be protected. He was adamant that this freedom of expression is key to the country's future. Having become president, we've seen a raft of legislative accomplishments, shall we say, where he's trying to suppress dissent. He's trying to censor social media. He tried to bring a high security zones bill. Okay, these are not things that the world, the liberal world, shall we say, is just going to look at and ignore, because these are signals, right? These are signals of what is happening.
The anti-terrorism bill that was tabled at one point was reversed completely. Now they're discussing to bring that to the table once again. Then we saw the online safety bill. I saw on the papers the minister in charge had said that they don't want to table it at this point of time. So when you look at it, we are not taking progressive action in terms of establishing democracy in the country.
You mentioned the UNHRC, right? So what is the main point at contention here. It's a question of justice. It's a question of accountability, right? So just take the president's utterances on the Easter attacks. Can you be more flippant about something so serious? 200 plus people died. We're still waiting for answers. We know it's been reported there was a clear link between the National Tawhid Jamaat, the NTJ, Zaran's organization, and the intelligence services. That's fairly well documented. We know that there are multiple questions as to where the explosives came from. The president insisted that there was no foreign involvement, but we know that some of the suicide bombers themselves had visited Syria in the months before. If there was no foreign involvement, then where did this extremist, or shall we say Wahhabist ideology find itself in Katankudi? Have we had an investigation into that, a commission, to understand where the extremism came from? Okay, it's not from abroad, let's say, okay, that means it's homegrown. What are the conditions that led to such radicalization, extreme radicalization in the East? That hasn't been talked about. Just take a look at recent history. The debt crisis. The debt crisis is a direct result of policy failure.
No, but Kusum, those are the lessons learned on the subject.
What I'm trying to show is that anyone from the outside, Shamir,
international investigation.
Whether you take the debt crisis, whether you take the Easter attacks, whether you take the questions of war crimes and reconciliation, the problem with Sri Lanka is that we have a lack of credibility, and that lack of credibility internally can also seep outside. And this is why, on one hand, the Sri Lankan administration will co-sponsor a bill in 2015. 2019, we reject that resolution. Now the president who helped bring the resolution in 2015 is saying the Sri Lankan government doesn't agree with international investigations, full stop.
So Kusum, this sort of schizophrenic behavior, has it, in the eyes of the world, turned Sri Lanka's foreign policy into a bit of a joke?
I mean, a foreign policy would be a good idea, Niresh, in my eyes. It's a bit, it seems like our policy is driven by whims and fancies.
So
foreign policy
really no
and domestic policy. Okay, so what does it mean to say in this modern context that we are non-aligned? It's tricky. So then why are we constantly repeating that same mantra? Why is the foreign minister, Mr. Sabri, why is he talking about the Canadian Prime Minister? Why is he putting his 2 cents worth into an international issue that doesn't have anything to do with Sri Lanka directly? And I'll answer that question. The question is that Sri Lanka is trying to be on the Global South's team. We are trying to show that, these Western, liberal rules-based Western order is, not working for us. That's the kind of sort of narrative that we are pursuing here. And I think it might be attractive to some people in Sri Lanka also. It's good to once in a way tell the West, why are you all asking us this question? Do you all think we're second-class citizens? I think that plays well to a certain gallery, and I think you all understand why he's making those statements. But
no, we don't get it. We don't understand.
I think it's an easy play to the ultra-nationalist wing of Sri Lanka's politics, isn't it? It's an easy win.
So you think that the president was playing to the ultra-nationalist wing?
I think a large part of his parliamentary majority consists of some elements that have shown great comfort with the ultra-nationalist elements in Sri Lanka.
If you look at it, Niresh, I was just observing the president's website before I came on the show. The DW TV interview was the only interview that was fully transcripted by the president's media division on the website. There is no other interviews that has been put on full transcript on the media. So I tend to agree.
And I just want to bring up
this seems to be a public gimmick.
So you mean that whole tantrum in Berlin was
but let's be clear, the International Monetary Fund themselves, in the recent governance diagnostic report, I mean, they have done their own studies, and they're looking at, they mentioned a water project that was $200 million
the diagnostic report was done at the request of the government of Sri Lanka.
Sure. And there was one paragraph where they mentioned that the cost of infrastructure in Sri Lanka is 3 times or 33% more than the global average. And then you look at who is Sri Lanka's main infrastructure partner in the last 10-15 years. It's not the ADB, it's not the World Bank, right? So in that case, we have to ask the question. It's nice to have a country being a development partner, but when things have gone so dramatically wrong, where now we owe you so much money and you've taken a very long time to restructure it, that questions have to be asked.
Dr. Harith, now this makes it very difficult for Foreign Minister Ali Sabri, where he has to battle it out in the world stage and take a neutral stand and win the hearts of the international community even at this point. What steps must he follow? If you look at powerful countries, we saw the Indian External Affairs Minister, very vocal, and he can afford to do that because they're coming from a powerful country. Now, that should not be the same footsteps that Minister Ali Sabri should follow, is it?
Yeah, just before getting there, I think because there was this deliberation about the ship issue,
yes,
and the conversation around it, I feel like that we are just venting out our own opinions and frustrations. But if you're looking from a very strategic foreign policy perspective, the questions should not be, I mean, of course, the questions can be, why are they doing national security threat, why are they doing seabed? But the question, nobody is raising the question, why doesn't Sri Lanka have that ability?
Sri Lanka has an ability.
Why don't we have the technology? Why have we not invested? Because understanding that we are a maritime nation, understanding the fact that it is a future of, we had the whole idea of a maritime future. We have this, we few years ago set up the Ocean Affairs Division at the Foreign Ministry under a Director General. So I think this question will never be answered by anyone. I mean, you can keep pestering whether it's China or Indians. Hydrographic capabilities, this kind of sensing capabilities, I think if we have a pragmatic foreign policy, another things we should bargain for is the modernization of our naval capabilities, which is part of foreign policy. That's why I said when you talk about foreign policy, it is very much in tangent with security policy. So you can't have a foreign policy thinking without relating that to security and economic thinking. So I think the question should be the question that should be raised and addressed is, when are we going to get that capability?
Yeah, the problem is Harind, if you look at it, doing a survey of this sort costs a lot of money.
No, I think that's it's not.
We are right now scraping the barrel.
No, there is something. No, what I'm trying to say, Shamir, here is, I can tell you how we are going to get it, and I'm sure in a short time you will learn that we are going to get it. So I think in the context of non-alignment and the ability to work with big powers, as you say, this is the conversation about big powers. I think the natural thing is we will reach to a big power and say, look, if you guys are concerned about a particular country coming and doing oceanographic studies, you should, under defense cooperation, security cooperation, you should provide us, because it needs a couple of advanced sensors. Of course, that we are not going to get a ship, but that capability can be acquired and should be developed, because the foreign policy thinking should be not about, it should be, immediate issue, but the thinking is this: it's about the next 5 years. In the next 5 to 10 years, we all have to understand we are in this Indian Ocean, which is heavily under geopolitical competition. This competition is day by day militarizing, right? And a result of militarization is it will lead to what we call weaponization of spaces. In conflict in terminology, defense terminology, in strategic terminology, and we are clearly seeing there are groupings that are taking place which are not just security arrangements. You see the AUKUS, which has come up a couple of years back, that is a security, that is a defense cooperation. So clearly this ocean space we are living is going to be militarized, and one of the major concerns in the future, because it is a maritime competition, is not surface but undersea and seabed. Seabed weaponization, seabed conflict has now emerged because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict with the Nord Stream sabotage. There is now a major investment of seabed weaponization already going through. So this is the strategic thinking. So as a small nation, the question we should ask is, we didn't raise it. So okay, the ship is coming. As you raised a point, you said yes, they are doing seabed research. So what? What is the actual national security or sovereignty threat to Sri Lanka? What is the threat? Is it the Chinese mapping our seabed? Is it the Indians mapping our seabed? Is it the Americans having advanced capability to do acoustic and post what we call acoustic networks on seabed to track submarines? So what? What is Sri Lanka's problem? Our problem, I will answer that as well, because none of us are answering that. Our problem is the strategic and the security challenge of Sri Lanka is the breakout of a conflict in the Indian Ocean, right? So our major security concern is not the rivalry. It is what is the possibility, or when is the possibility of a conflict.
But Dr. Harinda,
Yeah.
I know this for a fact,
Yeah.
because in 2019, when I was at the University of Oxford, the Oxford University, one of the divisions, one of the colleges, were researching the ocean bed of Maldives. And even at that time, to go to Maldives and do the research, it took a lot of money, because I was involved in that project for a few months, so I know it. And if Sri Lanka reaches out, if Sri Lanka can do so, there are ample opportunities available. Any institute like Oxford, maybe Cambridge, will come to Sri Lanka and do the mapping, but Sri Lanka doesn't even know how to get that.
No, I think
individuals of your caliber, Harinda, I understand, you come from a very versatile background, you've been doing this for a long time, and individuals of your sort are not representing the Ministry of External Affairs or Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Yeah, what I'm trying to say is, so, but we are having conversation on foreign
we're having conversation.
So what
the
I'm
thing
saying
is, we should equip ourselves.
Yes, what I'm saying
because
is
that technical know-how, we can get it, not that we can't.
That's my point. As well as we don't even need.
We don't have to have China doing it, or we don't have to have India doing it.
I mean, it is.
We can get an institute to do the mapping, and then get that data.
And we don't necessarily require institute, but I think in the context of foreign policy developing, there is a major. The Americans spend 5.5 billion on Syria, right, just to keep, so I'm not trying to tell you, so there is enough interest, because we say we are strategically placed, and we are arguing we are a strategically important country, so that's the currency. So
Dr. Harinda, now we are talking about we boast that we are strategic and all that, right? But are we really?
No, that is the thing. So,
and are we using that to our advantage?
So that is what I'm saying. My point is, we are not. We are thinking we are strategically important. Thinking that we are strategically important doesn't help us. So that is the challenge. So how do
now let's take the question that I posed from George. Now, when the Canadian-India issue happened, Sri Lanka took the side of India. Okay. When this issue came into play, the Xi'an 6, we take the side of the Chinese. Who are we holding a candle to?
No, I think these two are two different. I mean, I think that this is my primary argument of we are trying to oversimplify and conflate two examples. I think with Canada, I mean, if you are a Sri Lankan policymaker and if you see the pressure Canada has built up on the government, I'm not trying to say this is not me, I'm definitely right, and the fact that there is, we have the human rights challenges, we have the challenges at Geneva, then we have Canada going one step ahead and bringing. Listen. You have Canada talking about genocide.
Dr. Harinda, we've had. George, you've been in the foreign ministry for long enough, and you've seen how respective foreign ministers in Sri Lanka have tackled this matter.
No,
we've had good foreign ministers tackling matters of this sort.
My thing is not.
But are we doing it right now? That's what I asked you. What must Minister Ali Sabri do?
No, let me.
You don't want a minister's son representing the UN General Assembly and saying that he's an expert. You want to give advice to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as to what has to be done. George, you worked with Lakshman Khadirgam as well, if I'm not mistaken. You worked with, you worked with Rohit Bogalagam as well for some time. So you've been there, done that. We've tackled 2006 to 2009 was the most difficult time.
No, Shamir,
you were the spokesperson at that time, right?
You're using a conflation as an example. I'm not trying to defend the minister or not, but I'm trying to say is the Canadian example. I think Canada nobody's questioning we are questioning our domestic systems, our politics, but nobody's trying to bring out why the Canadians have gone that far. I'm not in Canada in general, but why there is genocide? Why is certain Canadian territories encouraging genocide studies of Sri Lanka as example? So do you agree?
Dr. Harinder, my point is not that. My point is when you have a foreign minister's son attend the UN General Assembly, expert advice. So listen to me, please.
No, you're taking something away. No, you started with Canada.
I'm saying experts like you have to be there in the system.
No, that's a different thing. But
that's what I'm saying. No, that's what I'm saying.
No, but you brought this Canadian example out. But I'm trying to say is Canada and the Xiangyang 6 cannot be compared.
My initial question was, what is the advice you have for the foreign minister? In a situation like this, we've tackled more devastating times during the war, especially from 2005 to 2009. There was a lot of work that had to be done. India was against us, the US was against us. We had David Miliband coming to Sri Lanka, and President Mahinda Rajapaksa treated them in Kandy. Don't forget, we've had problems like this.
Let me ask, has the government of Sri Lanka lost a lot of this goodwill that we had in the past? What comes to my mind is 1996, when the Cricket World Cup was in jeopardy, and Foreign Minister Lakshman Kadiragama, working publicly and behind the scenes, got a combined India-Pakistan team to come and play here. Never happened before, never happened since. In any sport, anywhere. India and Pakistan coming together, and he got that done.
And we've had foreign ministers in the
Can we do something like that today?
Let's not forget,
I'm not trying to argue a case of institutional memory loss. What I'm trying to argue is that we try to always, I don't want to speak for the foreign minister, neither am I interested in trying to say what advice I should give him, because I think that this conversation is not that place. But because we're not talking about a minister's behavior,
forget about the minister. Let me rephrase that question.
So
if you are to draft Sri Lanka's future foreign policy, what would that entail?
No, that would entail something very different. I think that is a good question you asked. You raised it earlier as well, because we are talking about national policies, we are talking about action plans, but in any country a foreign policy is built on a set of foreign policy pillars, which I've been arguing for a long time now within the circles as well, because now when I agree with George about the national action plan, national policy, but when we say when we say policy, where does the policy belong to? Where do we place the policy? Policies are based on strategies, which is we never talk in Sri Lanka because we think the policy is the final thing. No. How we strategically bring out frame our aspirations, that's the primary thing. Based on that only policies happen. But even for policies to come out, we need foreign policy pillars. Does Sri Lanka have a set of foreign policy pillars? Do we have anywhere in written or in by national statement set of foreign policy pillars? So when you have a set of foreign policy pillars, say what is our national economic interest, what is our defense interest, what is our for example, pillars also can adjust what is our policy on diaspora. So those are pillars. If you take Kenya has 6 pillars, so and which includes Kenya and diaspora. So based on that, whether you can be from party A, party B, party C, you can have the way you take your foreign policy. Policies can, but the fixed pillars are the other things that gives a policy certain stability. So that is something I think we need to really work on. That means even in Parliament, what are we debating on foreign policy? I raised this some earlier. We are debating about. You all had a different, but we are debating about people, like sons, daughters, drivers. But are we debating on okay? What is the strategic assessment for next 2 years? How is the foreign policy of Sri Lanka going to look? As you say, what can the minister do about
But you're not even answering that question, Dr. Haridhan. I'm asking what the minister can do. You're saying that he's not.
My problem is we are taking on that particular thing without asking, having a debate about where are the foreign.
Yeah, Dr. Haridhan.
Fundamentals.
Dr. Haridhan, the point is when public's money is being utilized.
No, that I agree.
Right. that is the time we have to raise a
Yeah,
raise an issue.
but we also have
Right.
to.
If the public's money is being swindled for the gain of a political party or a minister, then we will not stop
I mean,
talking. we will start talking about it. Whether it's the foreign minister or whether it's the minister of health.
That is agreed. I mean,
There is no question
There is
about
no
it.
question about it. What I'm trying to say is, when we don't have a set of, when we don't have a guidance.
I will ask you a question, Vilu. What can a 19 or a 20-year-old give expert advice to a minister? Forget about the forum.
Let's come back. Let's come
forget
back
about the
to
minister.
the original question.
No, I'm asking a very simple question. What can a 19-year-old who's after A-levels or doing his higher studies give expert advice to a minister at a convent or at a global forum?
Yeah.
And that speaks volumes of what the minister's opinion is of his own ministry staff.
No, that is a. I mean, that's a conversation.
This is where this is the problem.
Shamir, as a public servant, I'm the only public servant out of the four. There is a limit I can go on to express.
No, absolutely no.
So what I'm trying to bring out as an academy, because I mean, there's no point in me trying to say whether that is right. I mean, that's the morality check. I mean, of course, others can help. But what I'm trying to say is, we also should have the fundamental debate about why are we not having a set of foreign policy pillars or a foundation of foreign policy? Why don't we have any single document about Sri Lanka's foreign policy?
So who should set that?
That is a parliamentary thing. It has to come as
But we can't, surely you're not suggesting that our present parliamentarians are even remotely
then we have to
capable
have,
of that.
I think George might have some thoughts on it. We have to have, well, we have to start from somewhere.
Let's pick George's brain on this.
That has to come from within the foreign policy sector. That has to come from within the ministry. Ministers come and go, Shamir.
Yeah.
Ministers
But
come
the
and
pillars
go.
won't.
Exactly. The foreign ministry remains
They don't
static.
seem to
Static.
go.
Yeah.
So that is where you have to ensure that you know your subject area. You have traveled the world. You have represented the country internationally. You know what the concerns are. You know the issues that are being raised internationally. You must then have that as your main focus within. Similarly, every ministry has got to have people, and that is what the bureaucracy is all about. The bureaucracy has got to be strengthened in that way so that the bureaucracy is able to advise. The political leadership might pick and choose what they want to. They might change it, but you must have a consistent policy. This happens in other countries. And this is something that we've got to aspire towards ensuring that we have happening. If we go back in the past, it has happened. It's not something impossible, it's not something new, it's something that has been done, it's something that we should be looking at. And this is where the foreign ministry, the foreign service, the foreign policy sector, this is the group that should be formulating foreign policy.
Then only you can have
Sorry.
ask that question about what your son is doing. So, on what basis, on what kind of ground, what kind of contribution, based on what our pillar, what is the contribution? I mean, that is that as George rightly said, it should come from it, but it should go through a parliament.
If I may just log on to something
if it's going to affect the public, and if the public feel that the money is being swindled, we will raise it no matter what.
So if the money is swindled, the government has a habit of raising something else like VAT.
Absolutely, and then increasing the public servant service by 20,000
agree, and
rupees without having any.
respect the.
If I may, Dr. Harendra was talking about, I mean, the point is now we all agree that Sri Lanka is in a geostrategic location, okay? So, and we also know that Sri Lanka spends quite a bit on its military. So, we are in a geostrategic location, we're an island on the doorstep of India, we spend a lot on military. So, as Dr. Harendra was pointing out, this lack of strategy is glaring here because what is the condition of our navy? How are our naval assets? Do we have surveillance, high quality surveillance equipment in Sri Lanka? Do we have deterrence? Do we have missile defense systems? So it's all well and good to understand that we are strategically important, to understand that we are in the crosshairs of a great game. So what are we doing to prepare ourselves for that?
Right.
So that's what I was trying to raise.
So this is the question. So
is this the politician Kusum talking or
no,
expert Kusum talking?
not expert. Just I don't think it needs an expert. You know, it's pretty it's commonsensical. And another point that the president brought up, I think it's important. We mentioned AUKUS. AUKUS is a very new security arrangement. Okay, now the president is bringing up AUKUS, and he was critical of it. He said, I think he said AUKUS might be a strategic misstep. Now, in saying that, just understand, AUKUS is a product of the United Kingdom, the United States, Australia. So they clearly think it's a good idea. Even India has mentioned its support for AUKUS. In fact, at the last year's Atomic Energy Agency meeting, China and Russia tried to block one of the main components of AUKUS by appealing to the International Atomic Agency. They tried to pass a resolution to prevent the transfer of nuclear submarines to Australia, saying that this goes against the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. EAM Jaishankar himself said India has gone through the documents, they trust the IAEA, and they are very comfortable that AUKUS is a force for good in this region. So if India doesn't mind, Australia doesn't mind, the UK doesn't mind, America doesn't mind, Sri Lankan president comes out in a Western audience and criticizes AUKUS as a strategic misstep. Whether he believes that, whether he thinks that, is that the forum to say it?
Right.
So this is further evidence of not having a strategy.
So I want to give a minute each to the four speakers because we are running out of time. On your final thoughts, what is the way forward for Sri Lanka? So let's start off with Dr. George.
First and foremost, we must understand what it is that we want to achieve, how we are going to go about achieving that, and thereafter formulate policy that is going to be achievable on one side and as well as practical, but at the same time which is going to ensure that we are going to achieve our national objectives. The sooner we do that, the better. Every day that goes past is another day that is gone. It's another week, it's another month, it's another year. We keep talking about the next year being crucial, the following year being crucial, the following decade being crucial. What are we doing today in order to make sure that that is going to be crucial? What is the effort that we are taking? What are the measures that we are adopting? How are we ensuring that we say Sri Lanka comes first? How are we putting that into practice? We are a small country, we are a developing country, we have to understand those conditions, but that does not mean that we remain under the surface all the time, under the radar, trying to be completely low-key there. We have played a massive role on the world stage. We have chaired the Security Council of the United Nations. We have presided over the General Assembly. We've never thought about going into those arenas thereafter. And that is because of certain developments in history. We've got to be aware of that. Now is the time for us to take stock of what has happened, review those processes and reinvigorate what we are doing right now, because going forward we can't always keep saying we're having problems, we are getting caught between others, we are important location but others are having problems with us. We have to move away from that, right? We have to think about how we are going to ensure, if it is in terms of going back to that question about technology transfers. There are institutions, there are countries out there that are willing to work with us. We have got to reach out to them. This is where we have got to know what it is that we want. Sometimes we don't know what we want because we don't know what is out there. So there are facilities out there which are willing to cooperate with us, but we've got to make the step first. We've got to be proactive here. We can't wait for someone to come and then have a problem in our backyard. We've got to go out there, reach out to countries, talk to them, discuss it with them, and that is what foreign policy is all about. That is what our network of missions are all about. So going forward, we've got to be very mindful of the concerns, as very rightly was mentioned, the concerns that are developing. We've got to address them. We've got to know when to say things, when not to say things. We've got to know positions we should take, positions we don't need to unnecessarily take. We've got to also be aware of what it is that we want for this country going forward.
Thank you very much, Dr. George. Professor Samit, your final thoughts?
Yes. Missing policies, etc. was now expressed. I must make a note that China's BRI has signed cooperation agreements with more than 150 countries and 30...
BRI, what does that stand for?
Belt and Road Initiative.
Okay, Belt and Road Initiative, right.
More than 30 international organizations. And to my understanding, we are the only country which doesn't have our own policy on how to get connected to the BRI and how to use that for our benefit. All other organizations and countries have developed their own policies on how to be part of the BRI. That's number one. And number two is that we have to be very concerned about being non-violent. We have to remember that we are a plural state, because we have to prevail in this turmoil weather to come out of the crisis, and we have to be very friendly with the neighbors, like if I mention the words again, amity, sincerity, mutual benefit and inclusiveness. We will have to practice that to come out.
Thank you very much, Professor Samit, for your thoughts. Kusu?
Thank you very much for having me. And I just want to leave the audience with the idea foreign policy is about serving a country's interests. So those interests can be economic interests and security interests. When you take Sri Lanka's economic interests, one of our main development partners is China. India is a country that has had immense, shall we say, a very close relationship with Sri Lanka's political history. And our main trading partners, believe it or not, are still in the West. Our largest single trading partner is the United States, our main export market. The EU is probably next as a group of countries. We have to understand that Sri Lanka's domestic policy and Sri Lanka's foreign policy are intertwined. How the world sees us depends on how we manage ourselves internally. And how the world perceives us is critical in what we do with our foreign policy. It's not just about rupees and cents, it's about winning hearts and minds. And when any Sri Lankan official travels abroad, whether it's the president, whether it's the foreign minister, whether it's just an MP, you have to always understand what your country is trying to achieve abroad, and you have to always serve those interests. Going abroad and trying to serve narrow, localized political interests to score marks with a Chinese audience or an Indian audience or a Western audience, that is not foreign policy and that is not strategy. So I hope that going forward we understand that we can't forever be saying that we are in a geostrategic location and we have to take advantage. At some point we actually have to take advantage of it. And if we don't do it soon, we're going to miss the bus because the rest of the world is moving very fast. So I implore on the government, it's time to get your act together because time is really not on our side on this.
Right. Thank you very much, Kusum. Dr. Harinder?
Shamil, I want to end it with actually a appeal in a certain way because I think it goes to you guys as well because what we are seeing now is the way we look at foreign policy, the way and this whole critique about conduct of ministers, conduct of governments. I totally agree. You have the right, and it's your duty to highlight, as you said, if any money is swindled. At the same time, I think what Sri Lanka, these whole examples of UN 5, the Shinyan 6, is also the fact that Sri Lanka, as Kusum pointed, we are in a dire need of what we call force optimization. Our national security, our maritime interests, everything has to be guaranteed with the real reworking of our armed forces, our capabilities. So that is one of the priorities should be priority of this government, and I think this is where this question comes in. As I brought the next few years, what the challenges that we will face, we need a significant modernization of our capabilities, and you all can raise the question how money can be used to that. As you all raise the question of all this swindling, you all also can raise where should the money go and for developing what, because that question has not been asked. Nobody is talking about it. So we are only talking about ships coming and doing the scanning, but we are not saying, okay, how can we achieve capabilities? What is the real challenge? You brought out things like AUKUS, all these things. Undersea points to one thing: there's going to be a major increase in submarine traffic in the next 5 years. That is a major strategic deployment that is going to take place. So that is the major challenge Sri Lanka will face.
Seabed warfare.
Seabed warfare, undersea and seabed. It's two different things because we are developing so much of. We are in the strategic location because of the sea lanes of communication. Because we are connecting so many communication lines, the internet. So undersea warfare means a challenge on all those public goods.
Yeah.
So that is why Sri Lanka is critical. So we need to ask what capabilities, what kind of policies should the foreign policy and the national security policy should evolve, where that good money should go in. Yeah, while we question the corruption, we should also look at the investment.
The question is, Dr. Harinder, let me pose this as a question to you as well. The point is, artificial intelligence, data collection is going to be the major factor for countries in the future.
Yep.
When India said that Sri Lankan ID cards that they will supply it at $500 million US, the question is not about India's grant on this $500 million US on the Sri Lankan national IDs. The question is the data that is going out of the country.
Yeah.
So these are the little things that we have to be concerned about.
So we have what we call data protection, but we don't have strategic data protection. So that is another example of it's a good example you brought out. So so that's what I'm trying to say. Where we invest, where the money should go, where we should evolve our nation. Otherwise, having a great foreign policy without a great security policy,
It's
we are
not
gonna-
about just getting the money, it's about understanding what they can
what
do
I'm
with
trying
the
to say
data.
is that
and how
understanding
the
is
data
the,
can be exploited in the future.
that's why I started saying strategic thinking.
But not a free lunch anywhere.
No, and we have not strategically formulated anything. That's where we are lacking.
Thank you very
You
much.
guys can contribute to that as well.
We would continue to do so. Trust me, we would. Thank you very much, Dr. George Cook, diplomatic historian. George, you were with the foreign minister between which time, if I...
7 and 17.
7 and 17. But you were with the Minister of Foreign Affairs?
I was in the bureau of the foreign minister from 7 to 9.
9, right. So, tough times.
Yeah.
And do you think that more could be done now?
Of course. There's a drastic difference, and if you want to analyze foreign policy under President Rajapaksa, you look at 2 terms and you see a drastic difference between the 2 terms in terms of what happens in the first term and what happens in the second term. The first term you can deduce is quite good. The second term you might question in terms of leanings, but then also you must understand at that time we wanted more development assistance. Who came forward? We asked the world, only certain countries came forward. So there are other factors we've got to consider there too. So policy was formulated according to the environment that existed at that particular stage.
Thank you very much, Dr. George Cook, diplomatic historian, Professor Samita Hettige, expert on strategic studies and conflict prevention, Kusumbu Jatilaka, foreign policy analyst, as well as Dr. Harindra Vidanage, Director of International Relations, Kothalawal Defence University. Thank you very much, Niresh. Consultant English News Director at Newsfirst. Next week on the show, will Budget 2024 make you rich or even poor? From the frying pan into the fire, is it? We'll have this conversation next week on Face the Nation, but I leave you tonight with a quote, as I always do. No foreign policy, no matter how ingenious, has any chance of success if it is born in the minds of few and carried in the hearts of none. Take care and good night.